Hi class, hope you all are well. I'm going to be talking about World War II today, which goes along with the readings that we have planned for this week and also last week. So it's going to go along with those. I'm going to share my screen, which is a PowerPoint that will be posted or that is posted on Canvas, so you all can check out what it is that we're talking about today. So we are discussing World War II, a little bit about Japanese Americans, braceros, pachucas, pachucos. So let's give you some quick stats about World War II. It was a war that started in 1939 and lasted up until 1945. It involved 30 different countries, over 100 million people. There were mass civilian deaths, including the Holocaust, right? 50 to 85 million fatalities, including the Holocaust of some estimates are up to 11 million. So there's two sides to it, the Axis and the Allies. The Axis were countries that were against the United States, our enemies at the time. Germany, Italy, Japan, Hungary, Finland, Bulgaria, etc. The Allies were Britain, France, Russia, China, United States, Australia, New Zealand, etc. There's some more stats here that you can check it out. So how did it start and some issues that we're going to talk about. Uh, Japan bombs American naval station at Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1945, and the US joins the war. And by doing so, it provides opportunities to and for minorities, especially women, especially African Americans. So let's talk about Japan. There's all these um, conspiracy theories or assumptions that are about why Pearl Harbor was bombed. So a lot of what we believe is that the United States didn't have its foot quite into the war yet. The countries were already at war, and if you notice, the war started in 1939, but we weren't bombed until 1941, so almost 2 years after the war, or 2 years after the war started, over 2 years after the war started. So, what does that mean? A lot of people believe that, and historians will argue that the United States wanted to get into this war against the Germans, wanted to stop all that was going on overseas, and they had other intentions as well. So they started provoking Japan by stopping and blockading some of their like their food jobs and whatever out there, and Japan reacted by bombing Pearl Harbor. And the theories out there that exist will state that we knew that would happen and we allowed it to happen, very similar to what you hear about 9/11, right? So whether or not that's true, we're not discussing that in this class. We do know, though, that we were messing with Japan, and then Japan bombs us, and we go into the war. We dropped the A bomb on Japan, which was devastating for years and generations to come. But we're not talking about that today. We're talking about the war and how that impacts people here living in the United States and also south of the United States in Mexico. The United States joins the war and it provides opportunities to minorities, especially women and African Americans. Thousands of Chinese and Filipinos were naturalized. Why is that? Why do you think? It's a very obvious answer. So they could fight in the war, right? So here's some study questions that we're going to hopefully answer today. Do you think that the relocation centers should be called concentration camps? Defend your answer. Also, did race relations change in the American West during World War II? If so, how? So, hopefully, we'll talk about those in the next couple of minutes. Let's see. Enemy aliens was the name given to Japanese Americans. So, Japanese, Germans, and Italians were branded as enemy aliens, for example. Germans, and here's a very racist part. Let's backtrack a little bit, just in case you missed it. Why are Japanese, Germans, and Italians branded as enemy aliens? Because they were part of the other side that we're fighting, which we call the axis, right? Japan, Germany, Italy. So let's go back to here. So here's the racist part. Germans and Italians are kept under surveillance by the US government. In other words, German Americans and Italian Americans that are living in the United States are being kept under surveillance. Imagine if the United States were going into war with Mexico. Like, what are you going to do as a Mexicano or Mexicana if you've been in Mexico if you come from Mexico and been here like 2 or 3 years? Who are you going to fight for? Who are you going to be allied to? Are you going to be allied to the United States? Maybe some of you will obviously answer, no, I'm going to be an ally to the United States. That's a very easy answer. I've been here. I was born here. Yeah, but there's a lot of people that were not born here. Maybe they came last week or last year from Mexico. Those people, I'm asking them, are you going to be allied to Mexico or to the United States? So the United States, back in the early 1940s, all of a sudden gets into war with all these other countries, Germany and Italy and Japan, for example. And so they're watching all of them like, hey, what are you going to do? Are you going to like jump ship and go fight for Germany or Italy or what? So again, with the racist part, Germans and Italians are kept under surveillance while Japanese, 113,000 of them, including US born children, are put in relocation centers. Some people call them concentration camps. How is that racist? Well, it's very obvious why it's racist. The Italians and Germans are white. And we're fighting against Germans and Italians. We're also fighting against Japanese. Why did the Japanese get put into relocation centers? So what ends up happening is people started seeing signs in all these Japanese communities throughout the United States, especially in the Southwest. You have a week to move out of your home, take any belongings you want, and report here or report there. So a lot of people scared, they don't know what to do. They get their belongings as much as they can. They meet at a certain place and they get bussed off to like the middle of nowhere. And all of a sudden you're living in some barracks in the middle of a desert with a whole bunch of other Japanese people. You cannot leave. You cannot leave. And there was an instance of an older gentleman who was sick and tired of it. He decided to just keep walking. He wasn't going to stay there. And they shot him in the back. So you cannot leave. You're forced to stay there. It was guarded by military and barbed wire. Again, would you call them concentration camps? 2/3 of them were actually legal American citizens. 70% of the 113,000 were under the age of 25. So they were mostly young people. 65% were under age 21. And a lot of them were born in the United States, never been to Japan. Some of them don't even speak Japanese, but the United States is putting them in these camps. By August 1942, most of the West Coast Japanese Americans were either in wartime civilian control, the WCAA or the WRA. By November 3rd of that same year, 119,000 men and women were confined behind barbed wires. 6,000 new citizens would be born into camps. Imagine in the United States being born into a camp because you are Japanese, right? And here is a map of all the what do they call them, the relocation centers, or some people call them concentration camps. So by the time the United States realized what they were doing was unlawful, also they needed soldiers to fight, right? So they're like, oh crap, like there's like over 100,000 people. A lot of them are young, a lot of them are under 21 or under 25. Like we could have a lot of soldiers. Why don't we maybe we should ask him who they're allied to. We just assumed this entire time that they were allied to Japan because of our stereotypes and racism, and we put them into this jail, right? So they gave him a huge questionnaire. Number 27 of the questionnaire says, are you willing to serve? Let's pretend you are Japanese for a second and you're in a concentration camp. And they give you this survey. They say, fill it out. And then based on your answers, you get to leave or you get to stay in, or you get deported. Number 27 says, are you willing to serve in the armed forces of the United States on combat duty wherever ordered? Yes. Most people are saying yes. They want to get out of that place, even if it means fighting for your country. Maybe you'll gain equality. I'll go fight for my country. I'm 21 years old. Maybe like when I come back from the war, if I do come back, hopefully, we'll have Equality for my younger brothers and sisters, for my parents, because Japanese Americans are American too. Easy answer, yes. Number 28, will you swear unqualified allegiance to the United States? Will you swear allegiance to the United States? Easy answer. And faithfully defend the United States from any or all attack by foreign domestic forces? Easy. Yeah, I'm going to answer yes. And do you forswear any form of allegiance or obedience to the Japanese emperor? Wait. Why is that tricky? They're asking you, will you swear allegiance to the United States? Yeah. And will you forswear? That means, will you give up your allegiance to Japan? Will you swear to abide by the laws of the US and to take no action which would in any way interfere with the war if it's in the United States? Will you forswear your allegiance to Japan? What is that question assuming of you? That question is assuming that you have an allegiance to Japan, right? So therefore, the United States government didn't want to make this seem like a trick question at all. What they really wanted to do was, it was just badly written. Are you allied to the US? Yeah. They should have asked, are you allied to Japan? No. But they asked, will you stop being an ally to Japan? What does that mean? They're assuming that you are allied to Japan. So a lot of Japanese are like, oh, wait, I can answer that question, because if I answer yes, it's only yes or no, then I'm admitting, first of all, I'm saying I swear my allegiance to the US, but it's a two-part question. If I answer yes, that also means that I'm admitting that I had alliance to Japan. And remember, the United States and Japan are in broncas, they're in beef right now. They're in war, major war. So what are you supposed to do as a Japanese person? Are you supposed to say yes? Are you supposed to say no? If you say no, then does that mean you don't have allegiance to the US? If you say yes, does that mean that you had allegiance to Japan? Do you guys get the question here and why it's problematic, right? I have a lot of other examples to relate this to, but we're not going to get into that. Let's make this lecture short. So a lot of people failed to answer that question. In other words, they left it blank. And because they left it blank, they were deported. They were US born Japanese who had never set foot in Japan, don't even speak Japanese, were deported because they're like, wait, what's up with this question? I'm gonna leave it blank. All right, get out of here, right? Question number 28, refusal to answer or answering no. 18,000 Japanese Americans were segregated to Tule Lake because they refused to answer or answer no. 7,200 applied for repatriation to Japan. In other words, they were given the chance, like, do you want to go back to Japan, or what are we going to do? Put you in jail or what? So like, oh, I'll go back to Japan then. Like, if that's my option, I live here. In fact, as it says there in the statistics, 65% of those 7,200 were born in the US and they were sent back. What the heck does repatriation mean? That means repatria, go back to your home. How can your home be Japan if you're born in the United States? First of all, let's not call it repatriation, let's call it deportation. 7,200 were deported to Japan, right? 65 of those percent of those were born in the United States. Like, that's, to me, that's, I don't know, there's no other word to describe it as racism. No serious explanations were offered as to why. The internment of individuals of Japanese descent was necessary on the mainland, but not in Hawaii. In other words, there was 135,000 Japanese that lived in Hawaii. This is aside from the US, right? In the United States, there was like, what, 115, 120,000 people that were put into prisons. The population of Japanese in Hawaii, let's not forget that there's a huge population in Hawaii, more than even in the States, was 135,000 Japanese that lived in Hawaii. A lot more than in the mainland. 12 to 1,800 were interned in Hawaii. Think about that number. So like hardly any of them, 100,000, and only, it was 100,000 and only like 1,000. That's like very low number, right? Very low number was interned. Why is that? It's all a money thing, right? What were Japanese workers in Hawaii during the time? Take a big guess. They were farm workers. Oh no, we can't put our farm workers in prison because then who's gonna pick our crops? Who's gonna pick our sugar canes? Don't put them all in jail. Like if you have to, just put like 1,200 of them, but for the most part, just let them work. All right. So then that's when you realize that it was a racial thing. You just want to lock them up, right? Because if we have a history of racism in the United States. There's always been a history of racism in the United States, always, and always will be. And for example, since the start of COVID, for example, COVID-19 pandemic, we have witnessed the return of anti-Asian American violence. On Tuesday of this week, let's pay attention to this. March 16, 2021, Atlanta, Georgia, 8 people were killed and 6 of the victims were Asian or Asian American women. This violent and brutal murder was an atrocity that was also simultaneously racist, misogynistic, because they were women, xenophobic. There's so many things I could describe this. The othering and the dehumanizing of Asians. By othering, I mean they're considered other, right? Other, not mainstream American, they're other. The othering and the dehumanizing of Asians and Asian Americans, Pacific Islanders, Desi Americans is part of racism's long history here in the United States. For example, let me give you a couple of examples. During the gold rush in California, China, and we're talking about all Asians, Chinese miners were terrorized by white miners. In Los Angeles, in the year of 18, I think 71, the Calle de los Negros was a Chinese massacre that left 19 people dead. After they built the Transcontinental Railroad and major Western cities, built again by Chinese laborers, the US Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. In other words, no Chinese people could migrate into the United States, right? The institutionalization and the institutionalizing of anti-Asian sentiment led to criminalizing Asian Americans. They're criminalized nowadays. Chinatowns around the US were burned down. They've always have been. The 20th and 21st centuries saw persistent attacks systematically and personally using laws, media, pop culture to invent Asians and Asian Americans as exotic, as foreign, as aliens. And we saw what were they called in the 1940s? Enemy aliens, ineligible for citizenship. Hate incidents are not abating. We can't let anti-Asian American hate be a legacy of COVID or the last presidential administration, the last Trump. So in the year 2021, I don't know if you remember that. This is very important in history. March 16th. Maybe some of you were asleep that week, didn't notice not when those Asian women were killed. And we have that hashtag, what is it? Stop Asian Hate or something like that. Access to justice is a right. It's not a privilege. When the justice system doesn't work for every person, that means it's broken. And right now, the American justice system is broken. Not only do communities of color, especially black and brown communities, lack adequate access to legal services, they're also targeted, they're harassed, and they're murdered by officers of the law, just like in previous years with George Floyd. We have Trayvon Martin and the stars of Black Lives Matter. And the United States, especially in 2020, was a big mess. And I think COVID kind of like shined a big light on everything. So back to Asian Americans and what was happening with all them. 20,000 people that were Asian Americans served in World War II. They were proving with their blood, their limbs, and their bodies that they were truly Americans. I read a story in a book by Ronald Takaki where a Japanese man comes home from war with what do they call a sling, because he's lost his right arm in battle. And when he walked into the barbershop to get a haircut, the guy pointed at the door and there was a sign there and it said like no, and then a bad word for Asians. Get out of here, we don't serve your kind. And he had his medal of like honor or whatever he had for losing his limb and saving people's lives overseas. And you can't get a haircut. You know, that's been the theme for a lot of people. In the 1960s, African American athletes were going all around the world, winning gold medals. Then they come home. No, you're drinking from this drinking fountain, you know, not from that one. Like, we use minorities to our liking. And then when they come back home, we still treat them as like second class citizens, right? So why are there euphemisms for the relocation centers? They call them war relocation centers. They call them relocation camps, relocation centers, internment camps. Some people even call them concentration camps. Why are there euphemisms? Like, why are there different names for all this? Just call it what it is. They weren't forced. They were forced to be in there, and they weren't allowed to leave. Let's see. The Nisei, so the Japanese soldiers of the 442nd Battalion were the most decorated in World War II. And did that matter? They come home and they're still second-class citizens. The war was not against Hitler in Germany. It's against Hitler in America. And that is people that are discriminating and being racist against Asian Americans. And it needs to stop, as you all saw the events of March in 2021 and the murder of those women, right? It's a racist thing that happened. What did that police officer, sheriff say afterwards? Oh, the shooter was having a bad day. A bad day. I don't know. A bad day. Come on. I don't even want to get into that. No matter. Anyway, the Great Depression. Let's talk about more bad things against minorities. The Great Depression happens again with this word repatriation. The Great Depression of 1929 happens, a stock market crash, right? Who do they blame? They blame Mexicans. It's report, and they were deported, repatriated. It's reported that 1/3 of the Mexican population in Los Angeles was sent back to Mexico. Between 400,000 to 500,000 people went back. Some people estimate that the repatriation, the deportation of Mexicans as a result of 1929 stock market crash was upwards of 1 million people. So let's talk about why the stock market crashes and who gets blamed for it. Who is the scapegoat? Do you guys know what scapegoat means? So it's an old term, like back in the Old Testament days of the Bible, before Jesus made the ultimate sacrifice. People used to sacrifice lambs and goats, right? So you sacrifice like a baby lamb or baby goat, and you put its blood on your entryway and Passover. Anyway, aside from Passover and all that stuff, maybe you don't know what I'm talking about. You sacrifice that to show like honor to God. So you, by sacrificing a goat, for example, you're like cleansing yourself, right? And now after the death of Jesus Christ, people believe that they don't have to do that anymore because he already made the ultimate sacrifice. That's where we get the concept of scapegoating. You are escaping your sins using this goat, right? Made a lot of sense. And it still makes sense now, but we use it. You're escaping the real reason of the stock market crash and blaming Mexicans, right? One of the reasons why I believe Trump was nominated president years back was because he put fear in people's minds. He started like blaming Mexicans for this and blaming Mexicans for that, and it has nothing to do with them. Just like the stock market of 1929 crash was blamed on Mexicans. What do they have to do with the stock market crash? The majority of Mexicanos here were like farm workers. What do they have to do with the stock market crash? Zero, absolutely nothing. But if you blame them, can they fight back? Do they have a voice? They can't. They don't have a voice. So you blame them, you scapegoat them, and you deport them. And so let's see. World War II and the Mexican American. We're gonna skip this slide because you can watch it on your own. World War II and Mexican American youth. Let's talk about that. The youth were dressing up in zoot suits or in threads, as they called them, or drapes, also, as you see there. And a lot of these people that were wearing that were ended up being called pachucas or pachucos, and pachucos were seen as rebellious youth, which is also a very bad thing. Just because, like when I was in high school, I remember, we'd wear baggy pants back in those days, like a cholo. But does that mean that we're cholos? Nah, that's just a fad, right? That doesn't mean you're a gangster. If you wear your like white iron T-shirt with baggy pants and some Nike Cortez or whatever, that does not mean you're a cholo back in those days. If you dress like a cholo, it doesn't mean you're a cholo. That's just what popular culture was. That's what pop culture was. That's what you wear, right? The Ben Davis and the Dickies and the big baggy pants. So let's rewind back to the 1940s. People are wearing the pachuco, the zoot suit, and I have a picture of a really bad picture of it right here. So there's a jazz artist by the name of Cab Calloway, who's a crooner. He's a singer. He comes out on TV and he starts wearing the zoot suit. He's African American. And so that means a lot of people are looking up to him, just like we look up to, I don't know who's on TV, but I don't watch TV. But we look up to this person, like trendsetters, influencers. I hate that word. Influencers. We look up to influencers. Whatever they wear, we wear. So Cab Calloway is an influencer in the 1930s, in the 1940s. So people want to be like him. So they start dressing like him. And for some reason, people that started dressing like him got this like very, very negative stereotype put on them as rebellious youth, as you see here. So I want you to click on this. Malcolm X used to be a zoot suiter, right? Because that was popular. And so I want you to watch that. The zoot suiters, the pachucos in Southern California had like their own way of speaking, which was looked down upon by their parents. Their parents are like, speak Spanish, none of this combination stuff. So what they were doing, it's not even Spanglish. They're saying a phrase, and the last word of the phrase, they have to rhyme it with something additional at the end of that phrase. So for example, me comprendes or me entiendes, right? So people say, me comprendes, that means you understand me, like, or you know what I'm saying, you know what I mean? People say that often, right? Know what I mean? Me comprendes. And so you're rhyming with comprendes, so then you put Mendes. Me comprendes, Mendes, o te explico. Do you understand or should I explain it to you? It's basically like saying, know what I'm saying, o te explico, and you rhyme with explico, Federico. So you're not talking to Federico Mendes, it has nothing to do with it. You're just rhyming things. Me entiendes, Mendes, o te explico, Federico? Nel means like no, right? So instead of saying no, you say nel pastel, like nay, no cake. Here's a cool one that a lot of people use, right? Al rato. This one actually makes sense. Vato means dude, so later, dude. That one actually makes sense. The next one doesn't. Me esperas? Will you wait for me, or like wait up? And you're rhyming with esperas, and you use the word peras, which is pears. Me esperas a comer peras, which means will you wait for me to eat pears? Nobody's eating pears. Imagine seeing like three cholos back in the day and saying, hey, what's up, pumpkin? Not much. Lemonade. Hey, wait for me so we can go eat pears. Like, it doesn't make any sense. But it was all rhyming. That's actually a very hard thing to do. People look down on this writing, which, let's go back here, which they called calo, this rebellious youth. When you read Pachuca Panic, you're gonna know what I'm talking about. They spoke calor. Some were the zoot suits, aka the drapes, and they spoke this. ¿Me entiendes? It's like, you ever heard people say like, see you later, alligator, after a while, crocodile, stuff like that. Not too soon, baboon. I don't know. I don't know if I just made that one up. Understand, rubber band, stuff like that. But see you later, alligator, that's like calo thing. That's in English. So I don't know if it's like actual calo. I'm just saying that's an example of what calo sort of like sounds like. So World War II happens, and there's two things that happen. A lot of these pachucos aren't of age, so they can't go fight. Some of them are, so they go fight overseas. But the ones that stayed at home, the date is 1942, and there was a fight at a party, and the police ended up rounding like hundreds of pachucos, because there was the death of a kid. So hey, some pachuco was murdered. Let's go round up hundreds of them. The Sleepy Lagoon trial ends up being the trial where they try these pachucos Um, this is an example of yellow journalism. You guys know what yellow journalism means? Donald Trump had a very, very cool phrase that people still use nowadays for yellow journalism. Fake news, right? Fake news means like it's not real, they're just like making it up. So this was an example of yellow journalism. The LA Times, who already hated the Pachuco because they were seen as rebellious youth, talking, bad things about them. So one kid dies and they round up a whole bunch of Pachucos who some were not even at the party, right? So here's the issue though. The kid's autopsy done by the county or whomever stated that he was, yeah, the kid got in a fight, but the fight didn't kill him. On his way home, right late after the party the next day, he got hit by a car. So the coroner believed it was a hit and run based on like how they found him or whatever. So just because the Pachuco died, it doesn't mean that the Pachucos killed him. Yes, he got in a fight, but somebody hit him, at 3 or 4 in the morning when it was way dark and they kept driving. Not necessarily a Pachuco. It was probably like somebody just driving down that road, going home from work or going to work. They hit this guy, get scared, freak out, and they keep going. But that piece of vital information is left out of the trial. So what happens in the trial is they end up getting, I think, 12 Pachucos. They let the rest of them go. 12 Pachucos are sitting on trial for the death of Jose Diaz. Judge allowed the chief of foreign relations, the LA Sheriff's Office, Officer Duran Aires, to testify as an expert witness. And his testimony said this. He said, Mexicans as a community have a bloodthirst and biological predisposition to crime and also killing, citing the culture of human sacrifice practiced by their Aztec ancestors. That's stuck in core. How can you say, yes, these Pachucos killed Jose Diaz because their ancestors are Aztec and they used to just stab people during sacrifice. So it's already in their blood. And everybody's like, oh, yes, great point. Guilty, right? So those 12 are put in jail, are put into prison. What's crazy is that there was some other female friends, family, girlfriends, whatever, that were at the trial, and the judge sent them to an all-women school. They're not even on trial; they're just at the trial, like supporting these 12. The judge has them sent to an all-girls school out here in Ventura County, where they are there, and it's actually a jail because they're not allowed to leave, kind of like concentration camps. People are said that they weren't really bad, but you can't leave, right? It's like a women's school, but you're not allowed to leave. And he sentenced them there for like 10 years, like you have to be part of the school or whatever, um, which was horrible. Let's talk about what happened 2 years later. There was not enough evidence, and there was a Sleepy Lagoon defense committee that formed that finally let the 12 free. By 1944, their charges were overturned on appeal and they were set free. What happened to the girls that were sent to the Ventura County School? Nothing. They stayed there. Like, the judge wanted to punish them and sent them there because they were part of this killing, even though they're not on trial, which is illegal to do, and they were sent there. And then even after these 12 were found not guilty, that should have allowed those girls to leave. They still stay there. Something crazy happens though the year before, in 1943. You have the Zoot Suit riots of 1943. So May 31st, 12 say I call it the riots. I don't like to call them the Zoot Suit riots because it was a white sailor that started the riots. I don't know why we're calling them the Zoot Suit riots, but that's what people call them. Let's I don't want to go over this timeline, but let's give you like a bottom line of what happened. Sailors, sorry, were on offshore leave, and there was a lot of yellow journalism going on. For example, there was a lot of LA Times and articles, and a lot of articles throughout the world that were saying, hey, back home, the Pachucos, they don't want to go to war. They're at home dating all your girls while you're out here fighting, which was, I don't know how you could say that, but it's totally untrue. They don't want to go to war. Most of them were not of age to go to war. lies upon lies. Here's another one. Pachucos are wearing zoot suits, those baggy clothes. And that's why there's a blanket shortage overseas, which is why you who are in Germany are freezing your butts off because the Pachuco is using extra wool for his zoot suit rather than to make an extra blanket for you. How that makes zero sense. But anyway, the soldiers believe all this yellow journalism and negative journalism against Pachucos. So they already have it in their heads that Pachucos are bad people and that they need to be stopped, etc., etc. So these soldiers in 1943 are on shore leave and they start picking fights. And there's a huge riot where they rape, they stab. I don't think they killed anybody. They raped women. They tore off all their clothes. They cut their hairs if their hairs were long or in a pompadour or whatever. And then what ended up happening? The sheriffs, the police department, the LAPD were basically escorting these sailors. They were behind them to make sure nobody hurt the sailors. Guess who went to jail? Guess who went to prison for that? The Pachucos who were minding their own business on the weekend, right? The Pachucos. And what happened to the sailors? They were just, hey, go back to the ship, right? And I think I have that slide here somewhere. What led to the riots? Newspapers, yellow journalism, growing public sentiment viewed Pachuco Zootsuiters as foreign and un-American and a threat to wartime patriotism. Law enforcement also held a very prejudiced views of Mexican American Pachuco and youth and Native Americans as stated in the following quote. We're going to skip a couple of all these. Let's see. That's pictures of the Zoot Suit riots. People getting put in these cars, in the police cars. And it was, as we mentioned before, no real consequences were happened to the aggressors. Many of them were just recalled from shore leave. The people that were put in prison, in jail, sorry, were the Pachucos and the Pachucas. So I want you to take a look at the Bracero program. And we're not going to discuss it here, but let's talk about the Bracero program. Now, or why it happens. I think it happens in 1942. I have the timeline here. There's a big void all of a sudden. Like there's less teachers, there's less musicians, there's less artists, there's less of a lot of things because um, they all went to go fight overseas, right? A lot of these people turned soldiers and they had to go fight. Less farm workers. All of a sudden, there's this void that needs to be filled. So the United States invites Mexico to come into contract where they invite Mexicanos to come work and fill this void. In like the 10, 20 years of the Bracero program, there was 4.2 million people men that came from Mexico to the United States. 4.2 million men that a lot of them never went back or left their families out there. The idea was you come work, you help us out in the United States, but we also give you a living wage and enough money for you to send back home to Mexico. Not only that, we're going to give Mexico a big lump sum that's supposed to trickle down to you guys. So when you finally get home, you have enough money to buy, farm equipment, whatever, so you can continue this business out in Mexico. It's a bunch of BS that never happened. Maybe the money was sent, but I don't know what president kept it or whatever. Also, the cost of living for a bracero was around $11 a week during the 1940s. That's how much money it costs for your rent, for your food, whatever. $11 a week. Braceros were making $11 a week. So can they send enough? Can they send money home? Answer is absolutely not. Can they even save money to get home? Mm-mm. Mm-mm. There's no. So in other words, the United States government lied to all these people. So all these men who left their families couldn't even get back home because they can't even make enough money to get a bus ticket or a train ticket to go back home. It was a huge fraud against the Mexican people. Here's the worst part of the Bracero program. What do you think happens to all those kids? I'm not going to say 4.1 or 2 million of them were fathers, but let's say a quarter of them were. Let's say 1 million fathers left their kids. What do you think that means for Mexican youth? No wonder Mexico declined after the 1940s and 50s. I'm not saying that women can't raise their kids, but now women have to go out and find jobs because their husbands aren't sending money home. So now they have to go out and find jobs. And these kids are left on the streets. All of a sudden, in the 50s, that's when you start getting like cartels and all that stuff. And maybe I'm maybe putting two and two together and it doesn't make sense, but for me, it makes sense. You have all this street culture and all this stuff that probably would not have happened if you have your parents at home. I'm not saying you need a mother and a father, at least the mother or at least the father. Fathers are gone. Who teaches you culture at home? It's your mother. Who takes you to church? Who, teaches you how to pray? Who teaches you how to cook? It's your mother, right? And obviously you need your father as well. But now your mother is not in the picture because she has to go out and work, and probably double because they don't make the wages as what men do, right? There's wage discrimination. And what do? You end up in the streets. There's a lot of movies about this that we don't watch in this class, but that's the worst part of the Bracero program. You killed Mexico, man. You gave him a huge gut check, a huge gut shot. And Mexico was bent over, and I think Mexico's still bent over in pain because of the Bracero program. There's a cool film that I don't know if I'll watch it, but I'll summarize the very, very end. Braceros sometimes don't like to talk about their experience because they were hosed down like cattle. They were sprayed with pesticides. They were abused. They were sometimes even killed, and not a dime was sent home to their parents, their kids, their families, their wives, whatever. So a lot of braceros don't like to talk about that. And there's a very cool film. I might, show it to you all after spring break or something. The very, very end is always sad and it always gets me, where a bracero starts crying and he says, I don't like wish this on anybody. I don't know what to say, but it was the hardest time of my life. So if you have a grandfather, my grandfather came over as a bracero, and he never really talked about that issue. But some people don't like to talk about it. Some people like to keep that in the back of their head and try to forget it. And for some reason, the person interviewing this bracero had made them talk about it, and this guy just like broke down. He couldn't even talk about it. Like they were dehumanized. I don't think you understand what happened to the bracero in the 1940s and 50s. Oh, and I forgot to mention, by the 1950s, we have Operation Wetback, where they deport between 1 and 2 million people. All of a sudden, the war is over. We don't need braceros anymore. Get your butts out of here. And they deport them. They called it Operation Wetback. And it was a violent deportation, as in doors being kicked down in the middle of the night and deporting people, grabbing them, throwing them. They say a huge amount, I think like 25% or more of the people that were deported were born or legal US citizens. But hey, you're brown skin, just like that Asian American. You're going to get sent to the concentration camp. You're going to get repatriated back to Japan. You're going to get sent back to Mexico, right? And shortly after Operation Wetback was applied, they took that away because they realized it was unethical and it was violent. There was kids coming home from school to not find their parents, and that still happens today. Not find their parents. Parents are deported, and not like the repatriation where they take you across the border and dump you. They're putting them in trains and dumping you all the way deep into Michoacan, so that it takes you months to get back to the border if you decide to go back to the border. So let's take you deep into Mexico so you can't come back. Like it says, there are many U.S. born children of Mexican braceros were wrongly wrongly deported along with their parents. A very, very sad time. A very sad time for Mexicans. And this was in the 1960s. The bracero program finally ended and the Chicano movement started happening. And that's something else that we're going to get into in this class. But make sure you guys do the readings. Make sure you guys check out the summaries and the PowerPoints. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And if you have any questions, send me an email. We're going to stop recording now. Thank you.